Should 16-year-olds be allowed to vote? I've recently heard Nancy Pelosi bandy this idea about, and I also remember in the lead up and the follow up to the Brexit vote, there was a lot of discussion about this because it was generally believed that if 16 and 17-year-olds had been allowed to vote in that the outcome would have been different. And I think that this is actually raising some very, very interesting issues. Um, Superficially, on the very face of it, it does raise one of the principal problems with democracy, the idea of democracy. And of course, democracy is such a catch-all term, and people mean so many different things from it that it almost can be a chimera for any type of belief. But to the extent that democracy represents making decisions based on a majoritarian vote, and with that vote being based on one person gets one vote or an equal say for everyone, so at least ostensibly, one of the issues is you can determine the outcome, you can determine the decision-making process by setting who is in the electorate, who gets to vote. So you can pose any question you want, gun control, immigration, Brexit, not Brexit, drug prohibition, religion, whatever. And if you can define who can vote, then you can engineer a result that you would like. And so something like the Brexit discussion, you could get a different result by having different people vote. And this is something that kind of raises questions about the assumption of a legitimacy on the part of democracy. If it's something, if the will of the people, the so-called, can be uh, manipulated and controlled by the will of the gerrymanders or the people who set when the elections take place. And there's a whole series of other problems with democracy that I don't want to go into here. So there's that level. But I think there's another really interesting case. When I heard Nancy Pelosi suggest this, my first thought was, aside from that, um, 16 and 17-year-olds are required to go to school. They are compulsorily required to attend school, and most of them attend a government-run school or a school that is registered and certified by the government. So not really an independent agency, cookie cutter government approved copies, or nearly so. And not only that, they are legally not just disenfranchised, but they are legally restricted in a whole host of ways. They can't sign contracts, they can't own businesses, they can't, in many states and in many situations, they can't agree to get married or to have sex. They can't agree to work certain hours. They can't go into the draft. They can't own guns. They can't sign. They can't agree for medical procedures. They need their parents' consent. They can't decline a medical procedure if their parents come and say, "We're going to do this to you," and their 16 or 17-year-old child says, "I don't want this done." The parents can force that on them against their will. And this raises a whole series of questions because now you're talking about millions of people in the electorate who are essentially wards of the state to a large extent. They're going to school, they're being educated by government workers, and now you're saying, oh, they get to vote. And there's a similar issue with just even government workers in general. There's a conflict of interest when you have government employees voting about government policy because, to put very simply, they have the ability and the incentive to vote themselves more power and more money. Teachers' unions will vote for schools to get more funding. And although there are arguments that you can make about the utility of increasing school funding, there are also potential corruption, and I don't just mean corruption in terms of graft, but corruption in terms of people believing something, having a bias, having a dogma, and then even though they don't have any kind of nefarious or malicious intent, transmitting that through their actions and through their vote in this case, and by getting a bare majority, then perverting the rest of society to reflect an inaccurate, biased point of view. And I am actually very receptive to the idea that government employees and recipients of government largesse and welfare, including very wealthy recipients of government largesse and welfare, should probably not be allowed to vote. But certainly, at the very least, they are not second-class citizens in the sense that they are stripped of some large portion of their rights. It depends on the age that we're talking about and the state, but minors, people under 18, and or indeed even people under 21, in some cases, are legally less enfranchised than and less free than most other people. And this raises really serious concerns about their uh, objectivity when voting. That they can't just go and do whatever they want. They can't just quit their job and go to a voting booth. They are in a position to be lectured to constantly by their teachers, and their grades can be dependent on how they act, right? So their success in life, the state would have a huge degree of influence over their decision making and their ideology, as it already does. But at the very least, they can't then use them to magnify their own beliefs, which is what they do. I mean, if you saw the video, I mean, this is obvious and this should not be contentious, but if you saw the video of Dianne Feinstein being confronted by the Green New Deal supporters, these young children who had to be under 10, and it was clear that they were aping the words of their teachers and their administrators who were standing right there and who were interjecting when, when Dianne Feinstein would make a point that the unsophisticated 10-year-olds weren't able to reply to. Their teachers were right there to supply, the talking point. That was a hilarious video of two groups that I despise. They don't hold the kids accountable so much, but their teachers at least, kind of eating themselves. But it demonstrates the whole idea of one person, one vote is kind of bullshit in that situation, because you have uh, those teachers. There's one or two teachers, but then they have a class of 25 students who then become their mouthpiece. And they don't then only have one vote; they now have 20 votes. Now, granted, those were 10-year-olds, and the proposal is not to have 10-year-olds, well, it's to have 16 and 17-year-olds. But you can have the same effect. There's no reason that this couldn't happen at that upper level. But it also raises the interesting question of, if these people are not competent to sign a contract, if they are not competent to have a bank account, if they are not competent to agree to get married, if they are not competent to agree to have sex consensually, if they're not competent to join the military, if they are not competent to own guns, if they are not competent to agree to their own medical procedures or to pay for their own medical procedures, if they are not competent to decide whether or not they even want to go to school, how in the fuck can they be competent to vote and run the government? And this kind of illustrates, there's kind of two ways you could say it. You could either say, well, they are competent to do all those things. Maybe they should be allowed to vote, and maybe they should be emancipated legally in every other sense. Or incompetence and voting go hand in hand. And the idea that, well, they're misinformed, or they're gullible, or they're inexperienced, or they're ignorant, or their brains aren't fully developed, or whatever else. Obviously, all those things, if they are true, would lend to the idea that maybe these people shouldn't be able to vote, right? I mean, if you want to have good decision making, you don't want to have bad inputs. And I don't know what other way to say it, but if you're going to characterize somebody as having all of those limitations, that's going to be bad inputs. I mean, at best, you could say, well, they are stupid and ignorant, and so they'll make random votes in all different directions, and the average they'll kind of cancel out. But that logic does not work, because there are systematic biases, and so you don't get random distributions of positions or policies. You get biases in one direction or the other. A great book on that, for those who haven't heard of it, is The Myth of the Rational Voter by Bryan Caplan. Highly, highly recommend that book. But apparently, the point of voting doesn't require that. The point of voting is just to manufacture a result. As Noam Chomsky, as I'm loath to quote, it's manufactured consent. We can just some of the policies that we want can't be passed with who's currently voting, well, we can change who's currently voting by adding people who we reasonably expect to pass the things that we want, even if that group of people, in other contexts, we say are completely incapable uh, of managing their own lives. being free of even doing basic things like agreeing to fuck or work after midnight or whatever the case may be. So I think it's either a glaring it's a demonstration of a contradiction on the abilities of this class of people, on this cohort, this age cohort, or it's an admission that voting is not this magical social contract fulfilling um, most good for the most people thing. It's just a a rubber stamp that the people who are forming the die are the ones who are going to decide what the stamp looks like, and you're just if you're lucky enough to be the ink that they get, then you'll be on there, and if not, you won't. I do think it would be interesting if this could be paired with actual legal emancipation for those being allowed to vote. I would actually agree with that. I think if you're forced to vote, if you're allowed to vote, then you should not be forced to go to public school or restricted in the works you can do. Now, people are not pairing the two together. I do wonder if this was ever to happen, and I don't know what the likelihood of it ever happening are. Probably not great, but not impossible. Um, that suddenly you might actually have a constituency that would be interested in getting a pass, namely the children themselves. Children, the 16 and 17-year-olds who now can vote might decide to vote for themselves that they don't want to be forced to go to school. And they might have allies also in the people who don't want them to continue to be potentially indoctrinated by the authority figures who have complete carte blanche over 8 hours of their day, namely their school teachers and administrators. So, and some of you may or may not know this, but I've done other videos on this in the past. There's a great book called Teen 2.0. Basically, the premise of that is that evolutionarily speaking, cognitively speaking, and in terms of capacity and judgment to make decisions, once people go through puberty, they rapidly go from a childlike state where they really are deficient in a lot of reasoning skills and physical abilities. They very rapidly become adults. And yes, there's bell curves here and people go at different rates. So there are plenty of people who, when they are 18, are still not capable of making adult decisions and having good judgment. And indeed, there are some people who retain that inability throughout their entire lives. However, there's plenty of people who do possess that capacity when they are 15 and 14 and even younger. Again, it depends on the person. So that's a really great book if anyone's interested in looking at the data and the arguments there. Historically, kind of the idea of adolescence is a 19th century Victorian idea, and not something that, I mean, historically, once you went through puberty, you got bar mitzvahed or whatever, you kind of go off on your own, and you weren't a child until your 20s. You were a child until your early teens or mid-teens, and then you were off on your own. And there are reasons the government did not like that. A combination of social justice do-gooders saying, "Oh, look at all these young people who are out doing things that we don't think they should be doing. They're having sex, they're smoking, they're being delinquents." And then on the other hand, you had big businesses saying, "Hey, they're out there competing with us. They're starting businesses. They're working in their parents' shops, giving cheap labor. That's no good. It would be better if we just forced them all to go to school, and then they wouldn't be competing in the marketplace." And then you have the compounded view of the government. Like, oh, now we have these people in our school, and we can use that influence over them to our own ends, whatever those ends may be. And those ends haven't always been the same. You know, initially, public schools were there to stop people from being Catholic, to make them into good Protestants of one denomination or another, and then later to be more nationalistic Americans. Oh, you have all these immigrant children from who are Irish or Italian or Polish, and they don't have the requisite virtues that we think that they should as Americans. So the parents are lost. There's nothing we can do about them, but we can take their children when they're young, and we can use the however long the school day is and however many years it lasts to indoctrinate them to whatever goals we want. And to then, I mean, that's bad enough, but then to say, let's take some of those kids, some of those cohorts, And now, not only do we control them and we can tell them what to think and what to do and give them grades and have the ability to brand them for life as a failure or not. Or if you don't do what your teachers think consistently, they can screw you. They can fail you. So you have a strong incentive to please them. Like it's actually kind of a form of Stockholm syndrome, really. And if they tell you, well, you need to get out and vote for gun control, or you need to go out and vote for Nancy Pelosi or for the Democratic whatever against Donald Trump, blah blah blah. They're and just to say that literally every single one is a zombie and will have to do it, but they have this captive audience, more captive than people who simply work for the federal government or receive welfare, much more captive than just in terms of the hours of the day and the fact that they are legally prohibited from having their own independence in a lot of ways. So it's very interesting. You're dependent, but you're going to have a say in the government. I think that it's very, very illogical. I would take it if it allowed them to be emancipated. If you said, okay, you have all the equal rights, because then I think a lot of them would just stop going to school, and it might end up not being such a great thing for Nancy Pelosi in the long run. But I did think it was interesting and kind of illustrates some of those problems with democracy. So anyway, more videos to come, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye-bye.